Our speakers today, Negar Mihanyar, who's been a kind of member of our team for many months, who's been sort of a lead for taking some of the concepts around research and innovation, for example, food innovations, and taking this into now plans, designs, some of which have already gone in for planning permission. So Negar has been a great colleague, has a background in education, is a member of the Hawkins Brown and White architecture team that have been commissioned to design the Children's Hospital, and have really taken on the message and promise of what we're trying to do, both integration of physical mental health and also these other innovative aspects. I mean, the challenges that Phil set in his talk, and how could we deliver, and how does the physical plan of the hospital, help us to achieve those goals. And Negar is going to be joined today by Michael Rybel, who's been helping her with research. So it's my pleasure to hand off now to Negar and to Michael.
Brilliant, thank you, David. Just going to try and share my screen, so bear with me. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Perfect. I'll make that a bit easier for you. Okay, good afternoon. Thanks, David. And thank you for inviting me to join the brilliant discussions today. My name is Negar and I'm an Associate Director at Hawkins Brown Architects. I've been with the practice just over 10 years and lead the education and research sector there. I also have a lot of experience working in healthcare, and I'm currently the project architect for Cambridge Children's, supported by a very talented team. As a practice, we work across 6 key sectors. You can see them all listed here, ranging from residential to infrastructure and, of course, healthcare and education. We also have an in-house think tank with a full-time researcher, Michael Rybel, who will be on hand to join me for the Q&A after. The projects we enjoy the most are where different specialisms overlap. It's where we can use our cross-sector experience from one area to another and to help us to innovate. And this is why we got so excited when we read the brief for Cambridge Children's Hospital, a new model of healthcare, integrating physical and mental care, as well as world-leading research, and a much-needed chance to look at health and well-being holistically. There are 2 architectural teams collaborating on the design of the project, and the process has been fantastic so far. We have White Architecture, who are based in Scandinavia. They specialise in healthcare design. The image on the right is of their recently completed Queen Sylvia Children's Hospital in Gothenburg, and of Hawkins Brown, which I've just introduced. And while we also work in healthcare, it's our cross-sector experience and specialism in education and research, which we'll touch on today. One thing both practices have in common, though, is a strong focus on evidence-based design. We're not researchers, but we do believe that grounding our work in research helps us design better buildings for people. This is an example of a piece of research we recently completed to look at ways in which colour could be used as a tool in building design to support dementia patients. The way you process colour changes as you get older, so understanding the science behind this is really helpful for things like the interior design strategy or wayfinding plans. The research here is to complement a project we're delivering for UCL. It's a new translational research building which will bring together UCL's Institute of Neurology and the UK Dementia Research Headquarters. Although I'm not here to talk specifically about the design of Cambridge Children's today, I thought it might be useful to give a very quick overview of where we've got to date. Over the past 12 months, we've been very focused on developing the detailed clinical brief for the hospital and, as David said, preparing a full reserve matters planning application for the hospital and its wider site. You can see the image here of the main entrance to Cambridge Children's on approach from Robinson Way, for those of you who know the campus. And for those that don't know the site, it's just to the south of the existing Adam Brooks estate, immediately opposite the Rosie Hospital, which you can see just hidden here amongst the trees to the far left. And at the heart of Cambridge Children's will be what we call the integration hub, which you can see pictured here. It consolidates all the social spaces and circulation around this central atrium and provides much needed play and amenity at the ground floor. In this visual, you're looking back towards the main entrance, which will house a generous cafe space. And this will be supplemented by numerous ward kitchens, dining rooms, pantries, all throughout the building. And this was a key part of the brief to allow children and young people to have meals with their families and retain as much normality as possible during their stay here. The project is at a relatively early stage still, RIBA stage 2, which is focused on concept design. So it's absolutely the right time to take a step back to carefully think about what the design of the internal spaces needs to do. Happy to take any specific questions about the project in the Q&A. So the question I've been asked to try and answer today is, can architecture affect behaviour, and what role does or can design have on promoting healthy eating? I'm going to start by taking a step back and looking at some of the wider theory around architecture and behaviour. It goes without saying it's a very complex field, and by no means am I an expert, but I've been working with Michael and the team to try and understand some of the current thinking in this area. Then we'll move on to looking at some of the factors which could influence eating behaviours specifically, and then concluding with a few very early thoughts on what this might mean for how we design food environments in the setting of a children's hospital. So let's start with a quote you might be familiar with. "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." It's a very seductive quote. It suggests architecture can be an agent of change. It assumes a very simple linear link between buildings and their occupants. Process of cause and effect. Now, if only it were that easy, but I'm very pleased, I think, for all our sakes, that it's not. And although this can be true in certain circumstances, so imagine a room with no windows, or think back to the last time you were in a building and you couldn't find the stairs, so you were forced to take the lift, more often the reality is much more complex than this. Architecture affects people in a dynamic process. Users can shape a building as much as buildings can shape behaviour. And that's because people see spaces through a filter of personal experiences and their individual perceptions. Good example might be a church. So for many people, regardless of their faith, or even for those who have none, going into such a vast space can be a really uplifting experience. The scale and volume will almost certainly have an impact on you. The social impact of the space is also a really important subtext, and it relates to the religious symbolism, which means two people will come away from the same space affected in very different ways, and their individual perception could influence how long they stay, how they move through the space, and even how comfortable they are being there. So now, if we turn this on its head and think about how people can affect their buildings. Building 20 at MIT is a really fascinating example. It was thrown up really quickly during the Second World War and was always intended to be temporary. What this meant was that its occupants were never precious about the building and were free to make changes, to reconfigure, to adapt, ultimately to use the building however they needed and wanted. Amazing, really, that this modest temporary building lasted 55 years and is often referred to as a mega incubator for innovation. Some of the most successful early startups from MIT came from this building. At one point, 20% of the physicists in the United States, including 9 Nobel Prize winners, were working in this building. They were physically able to do what they wanted, but it also gave them the mindset that they could achieve anything, to literally think outside its box. So while recognising every space can't offer that level of freedom, there are some universal links which are well accepted. So it's worth taking a minute to understand how certain environments can trigger certain behaviour. So I'll give you 4 quick examples of this now. Firstly, natural light. Research has long proven that natural light enhances mood and improves productivity. Benefits in exposure to light can help people work better. They can be more alert during the day. They'll ultimately sleep better at night. Their circadian rhythms will be healthier too. In the healthcare setting, a study by the World Building Council has shown that patients required 22% less pain medication when recovering in sunlit rooms. Secondly, views of nature. It's also been shown to improve recovery, elicit positive feelings, as well as reducing stress. That same study showed that rooms with a view of nature led to an 8.5% reduction in the length of patient stays. Now, these stats are really compelling, and the healing benefits of nature are well established. And this has been a key driver in the design of Cambridge Children so far. You can see here a visual of one of the ward gardens. There are 8 of these in total on the upper floors of the building, all accessed directly from the patient wards. And one of their primary functions is to bring daylight and nature directly into the heart of the hospital. Okay, so moving on to ceiling height. If we go back to the church example, we'll all have experienced firsthand the impact of being in a very tall room. By contrast, think to how you felt when you moved through a very low space. Controlling ceiling height is a really valuable tool and can be powerful in creating thresholds and drama in spaces. In 2007, Rice University did an experiment to look at the impact of scale on our brain activity. It concluded that the experience of high ceilings activated exploratory parts of the brain, which are really key to processing spatial complexity. So this is linked to a feeling of freedom. It also highlighted that for these benefits to be really heightened, these differences in ceiling height had to be actively marked. So not relying on the subconscious parts of the brain to recognize level changes. You can often see this reflected in feature lighting or pendants hanging in a big atrium, like the example here, to make the maximum psychological benefit of the volume. For me, this is a really interesting study because there's often a long-standing debate in architecture about whether big atriums really foster innovation. And there's often pressure on projects to justify or to try and quantify their impact. And I added this final one in because it's something that comes up a lot in our projects too. We're often asked how we can design for collaboration. Project is a new innovation centre for Cardiff University. You can see on the left an image of what we call the oculus. It's a central void which cuts up diagonally through the building. It was designed to provide better visibility between the floors and encourage people to move up and down locally in a more informal way. So rather than having one very tall atrium, which you might expect in a building like this, the relationship between floors is a bit more direct and accessible. There was actually quite a lot of science that went into designing it, which you can see on the right here. We worked closely with a specialist to do some flow analysis, to test sight lines and people movement to optimize chance encounters. Placing key social spaces around the atrium was also really important to fuel the activity. And one thing I really like about this project is that the focus on collaboration and the collective experience has even influenced the eating strategy. And this identified in its brief a preference for shared plates and tapas style meals, which is quite unusual in an education setting. Project is due for completion later this year, so it'll be really interesting to monitor how the food strategy evolves over the life of the building. So that's a really good segue to move into thinking about how spaces can influence eating behaviour a bit more specifically. Research often categorises key influences on eating behaviour into 3 key groups. You can see here there are individual factors related to your lifestyle, biology or personal experiences. We have social factors, so upbringing, family, cultural influences, and then we have physical factors, be it your home setting, a school, or generally where you consume food in our instance. Now, as architects, some of these we have more control over than others. I think it's also important to look at this through the lens of how stress affects eating patterns. For many people, a hospital environment can be very stressful. People can feel nervous or anxious about their visit or stay. We also have to be really sensitive to the fact that for some, the act of eating itself can also be very stressful. And this is very clearly articulated by Nancy and Lynn in the talks this morning. So it's clearly a complex issue, but stress is a factor that we need to understand. From a physiological perspective, and many of you on the call will be better placed to explain this than me, stress causes your body to release cortisol. When this happens, you might notice an increase in appetite. I know this is certainly true for me, an urge to eat sugary, salty or fatty foods. So if we can reduce stress levels through comfort and personal choice, I think there's a good chance we can improve eating habits in a hospital setting. With this in mind, let's try to be a bit more specific about what we're looking at. As architects, I'm afraid we can't do much about individual factors. We should, however, consider social and cultural comfort. Of course, we need to make sure we are designing inclusively to cater for all, and we absolutely must consider spatial and atmospheric comfort. I'll give you a few examples of what I mean by these now. So, starting at the socio-cultural level, there are sometimes quite distinct differences in eating rituals between different cultures. I'm Iranian, and when I was a child, I was acutely aware that meal times at home were very different to when I was invited to a friend's house for dinner, for example. In Iranian culture, it's very family-centric activity to have food together, of course helped by the fact that my grandmother was a very fantastic cook. And we sat on the floor for our meals around what we called the sofra, essentially a tablecloth on the floor. A more commonly recognised example of differences between West and Eastern cultures, there's the often embarrassing misunderstanding where in the West, it's expected that you finish your plate when you've enjoyed a meal, while in other cultures that would be considered rude. The other component to this, of course, as I touched on, is the physical ritual, which again will be influenced heavily by socio-cultural factors. So do you dine around a formal table, for example? Can this be hierarchical where one person leads at the head of the table? For some, this might be totally normal, while for others, it could instill a sense of dominance, which might create unnecessary pressure around meal times. I really enjoyed Nancy's observations about this earlier, very insightful. Does a round table allow people to feel more anonymous and equal during meal times? And then there's the whole debate about TV culture. While universally condemned as a negative contributor to eating behaviour, fortunately, it is a common reality for many, so we do need to consider it. And then regardless of where you eat, so you might not physically be sat in front of the TV. These days, there might be so many digital devices and tablets at the table that it has a very similar effect anyway. Ultimately, for many, food intake is a social activity. It's not just about eating, it's about the exchange and the social development that this allows. So we need to look at social comfort in general. With all these variables, it's impossible to find a common denominator. So as architects, it's important that we offer familiarity and choice to make sure that we don't exclude anybody. Linked to this, of course, is wider spatial comfort. When you go into a bar or restaurant, what are the things that typically influence where you're most comfortable sitting? Generally, for settings that are occupied for a short period of time, people often choose architectural features such as walls or columns to help define their personal territory. It's a mechanism to control the space around you. It allows you to be less observed. Often people avoid having their backs exposed, so these would be your unpopular seats. Instinctively, this is to reduce your ability to increase your ability to manage interactions around you. It's all very primal responses. And then once a group's territory is defined, the positioning of individuals around a group can also affect behaviour. And then finally, in terms of atmospheric comfort, this can include a whole range of things from colour to light, smell, noise, and even distraction. And all these influences can directly impact how fast we eat, how long we stay, and how much we eat. I should probably apologise for the slide on McDonald's in a talk about healthy eating, but bear with me. What's interesting about this as a case study is the branding and colour association. You might have noticed that many fast food brands are often using bright primary colours, mainly reds and yellows, so McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, for example. Studies have shown that red is stimulating, exciting, and it can increase your heart rate. It kickstarts your appetite and is chosen primarily because it's thought it encourages you to eat. You might also have noticed that many McDonald's outlets were refurbished and rebranded to green, a colour associated with nature and healthy eating, especially important at a time when we've got a stronger focus on the environment and our individual health. Interestingly, you can see the space still has a lot of bright artificial light to keep you stimulated and alert. The seating is designed to allow you to stay, but only long enough to finish your meal. Overall, it's a pretty efficient transaction of what you eat and the sensory stimulation you get from the space. And by contrast, think back to the last time you went out for a nice meal. Dim ambient lighting, slow music, more intimate setting, colours selected to encourage you to take your time and relax, to have that extra glass of wine or two and dessert. Whether we recognise it or not, the physical setting plays an important part in how we interact with the food that follows. And then finally, on atmospheric comfort, smell. Your nose is a really important component of your taste system. Dacre talked very clearly about her fascinating work here, so not going to go into the science on this. Often it works very subconsciously, so it can trigger memories and past experiences, be it good or bad. Think of the smell of freshly baked bread when you're trying to buy a house, or the immediate hunger pangs you get when you smell something delicious, even if you didn't think you were hungry. Manipulating smell can be positive in some circumstances, but in a hospital setting in particular, it's really crucial. And in our case, we'll have children and young people coming in for operations who might be nil by mouth, or we'll have those visiting the specialist eating disorder wards. The last thing they want or need is the smell of food pouring through circulation spaces. I've also just learned from Dacre's talk that your sense of smell declines after the age of 31. So as she said, many of us designing this building won't have as good a capacity to smell as the children we're designing for. So it's absolutely crucial that ventilation design can regulate and manage smell within very designated spaces. There are other factors too, like light, sight lines, distraction, how noisy a space is, and it can all affect our experience and interaction with food. So the final part of the presentation, we try to bring together all these strands. We're trying to create a stress-free environment that offers comfort, spatial ownership, and personal choice. And when I was preparing this talk, I was struck by how similar some of these issues are to how we often design workplace and research settings. And in fact, this is an approach we're adopting for the Research Institute within Cambridge Children's. It's based on a design theory called activity-based working. It sounds complex, but it's actually pretty straightforward. So essentially, it means that different people prefer different types of settings for their individual tasks. Could be, as you can see here, private office for concentrated tasks, open plan spaces for collaboration, and a whole range of different spaces between, be it booths, sofas, breakout tables, etc. You share the spatial allowance, so the metre squared per person, to offer a much richer variety for everybody to enjoy collectively. And a bit like eating, what this recognises is that there's not one solution that fits all. So could we, in a very similar way, look to offer a wide range of eating scenarios where people can choose between different settings depending on their individual needs and what they're comfortable with on any given day? Could be a kit of parts, which can dial up or down based on some of the themes we've talked about, like how social are the spaces, is there sufficient privacy and dignity, do we prefer to sit at a table, which reminds us of home, so the domestic setting, or would people prefer a more quiet and controlled environment, so something very different from home? Putting this into practice, you could look at moving away from what you'd expect in a typical hospital setting to something much more playful. So imagine this is a floor plan of a cafe with different types of seating, and the dots here represent people. You'd need to carefully consider movement and flows. Sight lines across the space are also really important. Protected edges, we talked about the instinct to hug the perimeter of a room, and also, of course, the range of social and individual eating spaces. There might also, I think, be an opportunity to consider how we integrate play in this setting. We mustn't forget we're designing a space for children. Play has been a key driver for the project. It's something that's come across really strongly in all the co-design and the stakeholder engagement we've done. And as one of our young people very clearly articulated, play is second only to staff. So could we think about a sort of play-centered design We can harness the role of play in building positive food habits, a play kitchen, planned interactions with food which aren't stress-fueled, a positive distraction to the potential stress and anxiety of being in hospital. We've of course got to be mindful that the hospital doesn't just cater for young children, but adolescents, parents, staff and visitors too. So age-appropriate design is really important. And it's also likely there will inevitably be pressures to manage and regulate some of the catered spaces by whomever is responsible for them day to day. So all of this will need to be very carefully balanced. So to come full circle, I think there's a very dynamic relationship between how buildings and people can affect each other. There's certainly not one solution which can address a very broad range of personal dispositions. What is very clear is the importance of designing stress-free environments, allowing spatial ownership and personal choice. And in a project that's underpinned by a unique integrated model of care, we need to think innovatively about how we can deliver food with care. That's everything from me. Let me try and stop sharing.
Fantastic, Negar. Thank you so much for giving us that tour and your kind of thoughtful approach, which we've seen in every aspect of the design of Cambridge Children's. And there were a number of themes you brought up and really nicely wove in from earlier talks, including green spaces, behavior, and also collaboration. And maybe this will reflect a question in the chat from Kate Gould. How are we going to take input from our stakeholders, that could include people in food production, to be sure that the hospital is sort of fit for purpose and can actually, again, show what good looks like?
Oh, absolutely. I think today is a fantastic start to that. I think getting all the expert opinions, everybody will have slightly different pushes and pulls in terms of priorities around this. I think that's fundamental to giving us a brief to start with. I think it's very early stages in terms of deciding the provision that goes in and the quality of the nutrition and food. I think following that, I think in a similar way to how we've got specialist work streams around different topics in the school, so integration or schooling, I think it's important that this also becomes a dedicated work stream because it's so fundamental. I had a quote which I took out at the last minute, but it really beautifully put the fact that food underpins life. So if we get food right, we get everything else right. It all falls into place in a much more coherent way. So I think this actually does underpin a lot of the work that we're trying to foster in this new model of care.
That's a great suggestion, actually. I think when we come back to the action items and maybe the lessons learned from today, that could be one, is that we really do need to kind of think about this involving different perspectives to deliver on what's really an exciting area. And I'm really glad we're having a chance to cover it in detail. I wonder if Michael wanted to add any other perspective from his involvement in the project.
Okay. Hello. Sorry, I switched on the light. Thanks for inviting me. I think when Negar asked me about this, sort of I deal a lot with this problems with all sorts of typologies in various settings. The question is always the same: how can we sort of use architecture as a tool for change or for impact? Let's put it neutrally. And you can read so many studies that the link is always very correlational and it's very difficult to establish. And what I would sort of dream of or think, which I always try to include in any of these conceptual designs, is when you have a setting which can dynamically evolve, you can actually learn a lot from that. And if looking at the last images of Negar, if you have a sort of a flexible setting which can evolve over time, it could almost be a piece of research, like a piece of lab, where you can study how different visitors or patients of the hospital use the space, and there's a feedback loop. And I would keep it as open as much as you can and sort of try to remove the obstacles in having the space evolving over, let's say, 10 years as a piece of live research.
Fantastic. That's good. That's a great place to leave it. I think and we'll be able to come back to some of these concepts in the panel. And Negar and Michael, maybe you can monitor the chat. There's a lot of very kind of positive comments and some questions which we can you could answer in the chat, or else we can come back to in the panel. So thanks again for a really interesting, wonderful tour.